Hi, everybody. I'm just going to quickly introduce our, not brand new anymore, but pretty new Executive Vice President for Impact, who will moderate us today. And we'll introduce our esteemed panelists in a short while. Thank you all for joining us. It's for those of you who have been with us all day. There have been many events. Most of them have had a pretty big focus on mitigation, and we're really excited to now have a panel that's really focused on adaptation, on how we need to adapt here in the US, also globally. And I like to think of it as a little nice twist, what we have to learn from others in developing countries who may have had to adapt in some cases sooner rather than later. And so hopefully we'll get to hear some inspirational stories of adaptation from different parts of the world. So let me introduce Angela. Sorry, and for those of you who haven't been here all day, I'm Jennifer Chalmers, Senior Director for Climate Resilient Food Systems. And it's, again, really nice to have you. Angela joined us this year, as did I. And Angela most recently came from the World Bank, served as the head of the Secretariat of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition for 5 years. And before that was with the Swedish Energy Agency, where she was for 14 years. Did I get all that correctly? So I'll keep the introduction short. And I'll turn it over to you, Angela.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think for now I'll stand up since, as you can tell, I am vertically challenged. So this way I can see everyone at the back of the room. Thank you very much for joining us. This is the last session of the day, a day that has been extremely rich in discussion and where we've tried to understand the challenges around climate change, agriculture, food production. As Jennifer said, we will focus now on adaptation. And we know that, and you will hear this from the work from the panelists, that from their work, we are seeing that climate change will make the situation worse. It will exacerbate the decline in food systems, which will, of course, impact farming economies, in particular in the global south. And therefore, for this reason, we really need to start thinking about how do we prepare, plan, and respond to those impacts? And we know that while large-scale agriculture in developed countries has played an important role in increasing global food production, we're concerned that there's insufficient attention being paid to the production impacts of future climate change and the need for transformative adaptation. So this is what we're going to be talking about. Now, adaptation is a global challenge. We know that this has been a priority for many developing countries, but I think there is a reason for all of us in the North and in the South to really be thinking about this, because when this boat sinks, it's not going to be only one part of the boat that will sink. We're all in this together, and therefore there is a clear reason why we should all be thinking about the impacts of climate change and how we respond to them. So a few years ago, I spoke to someone who evidently was a wise person, who said to me that whenever you have a problem, it is an opportunity to find a solution. We have a tendency to talk about problems sometimes ad infinitum. Today, we're going to talk about solutions. And I think that's a note I want us to end this day of deliberations on, thinking through the solutions that are at hand that we can avail ourselves to, and the solutions that we may want to put our heads together to develop for the future. So to kick us off, we have with us the US, I have to put my glasses on now, the US Special Envoy, Carrie Fowler. Dr. Fowler is an environmentalist and an agriculturalist, and he understands that the way we currently feed the world is not sustainable. And he has dedicated his life to addressing climate change and world hunger. And for that, we really appreciate Dr. Fowler. He produced the world's first assessment of the state of the world's crop diversity. And he's known as the father of the Svalbard global seed vault in Norway. He has navigated bureaucracy and compromise at the UN FAO, and as the founding director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust, and in negotiating the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. So his work was built on the understanding that hunger is not only caused by a lack of food, but also by food systems that can create and increase inequities and can eliminate local, regional, and traditional methods of agriculture that contributed to sustainability and resilience. Without further ado, I'd like to invite you, Dr. Fowler, to provide us with a keynote address.
Well, thank you. This is a special occasion for me on a personal level because the best man at my wedding is a former chair of the board of the Environmental Defense Fund and former co-chair of the Action Fund here, and that's Frank Lloyd. So at some point, my colleague Joseph, who's out here, will have a picture of me with the EDF logo behind it. That can send to Frank. There he is. Great. So I think most talks about the food crisis start off by numbing everybody in the room with all the numbers of starving people and hungry people and food insecure people and stunted and wasting children and all of that. And I don't want to do that, but I do want to say that the food crisis that we're experiencing now is, I think, is the deepest and most profound food crisis of our generation. And it's not going to go away this year. It has, I think, a chance of getting worse before it gets better. I think all of us understand now that this crisis is multi-causal in nature. We most often talk about the three C's being climate change, COVID, and conflict, and the four C's. But you could add to that a few other things, and one is a fertilizer crisis, historically high prices of fertilizer and really lack of availability in some areas, particularly Africa. You can talk about historically low stockpiles. There are issues with water. 21 of the world's 37 major aquifers are being depleted. Agriculture is already taking 70% of the water globally, freshwater supplies, and 80% in a number of areas. And we have export bans that countries are imposing on grain and other exports. So these are some of the factors that are plaguing us right now. I want to mention a couple of points about two of them in particular. Conflict. About 60% of the people in the world that are food insecure today are living in countries that are facing conflict, experiencing conflict. We can't ignore the relationship, both cause and effect, that conflict has with food security and vice versa. And the other, of course, is climate change. Last month, August, was the 452nd consecutive month in which the global average temperature for the month, August in this case, exceeded the 20th century average. 452 consecutive months above average temperatures. For anyone who's a climate change denier, 452 straight months of above average temperatures has to be a lot of coincidence in a row. That's what we're facing, and that has an incredible impact on agriculture. Not just producing higher average temperatures, but longer periods of extreme weather, higher highs, et cetera, longer extreme temperatures at very inconvenient, if you will, times in the growing cycle of a plant, such as when it flowers and produces pollen. Last month, August, also saw us record the highest average temperatures ever for the Northern Hemisphere and for China. Clearly something's happening. Clearly we need to adapt. My friends and colleagues at Stanford, who produced recently a report on global food demand for 2050, estimate that we're going to need to have about 57% more food by 2050 from the base year of 2019. Now, take a step back and say that, in the absence of facts or real knowledge, what we human beings typically do is we make assumptions to try to help us explain how the world operates and what's going to happen in the future. The assumption that we're making right now about our food system is that somehow we're going to produce more food with less land, with less water, and with the most extreme climates that we've ever experienced in the history of agriculture. What could go wrong? So I've in recent days looked at modeling food production. And much of that modeling, of course, is looking in the rearview mirror and projecting forward. And so you can see models, you can find them very easily. It'll say, well, by 2050, we will produce 50% more food. But if you look at the footnotes of those studies, which I typically do, you will see that the model will tell you that it excludes a few things. It excludes income inequality, it excludes climate, it excludes conflict. What could go wrong? So that's kind of where we are. But if you look at what the effects of climate change are likely to be with our agricultural crops, you can also find studies that will tell you that for each increase of 1 degree Celsius in temperature, we're going to have about a 10 to 25% more in pest damage. Higher temperatures also cause our grains to be reduced in terms of in terms of their nutrient value. And you can also find studies of some of our major grain crops that will say, well, in this climate change scenario, they'll be yielding 10 to 15 to 20% less. So not 50% more, but less in terms of yield, more in terms of pest damage, et cetera, et cetera. I think we're particularly vulnerable, by the way, and I wanted to focus on where I think we're going wrong in terms of making false assumptions. I think we're particularly vulnerable in all but the top 4 crops. So, and that's a lot. So if you think about rice, wheat, corn, soybeans, there's an immense amount of investment, private sector and otherwise, going into those crops. What's happening with all the rest of the crops? The roots and tubers, the vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. There's some of those crops that have never, half of those crops, by the way, that have been domesticated and entered into commerce. Half of those crops have never had a single Mendelian plant breeder working on them. What's the avenue, if you're a biologist, if you're a Darwinian, what's the avenue to adaptation of those crops with no plant breeding, formal plant breeding activity going on and a lack of diversity from which farmers can make selections? So I think one of the things that we need to be paying attention to is the entire farming system, not just the top 4 crops and not just in an ideal scenario involving climate and other factors. The last thing I'll say is that we also need to be aware that there's no one farming system in the world. When you look at different countries, different situations, you find a rich patchwork of different kinds of farming systems. And what that should tell us in this country is that there's no one solution. There's no magic bullet. What we need to be doing, I think, is listening to other folks, particularly from different farming systems, being humble about what we think they should be doing, practicing the Hippocratic oath of first do no harm. And when we, on the rare occasions when we think we do have the magic bullet and it's a no-brainer, we ought to be asking ourselves, is this also a no-brainer for the people that we're about to give it to? I think if we begin to do that, we'll begin to forge a different kind of relationship with our partners around the world. At the State Department, I'll tell you just very briefly that we're particularly focused, I think, on both on climate change and food security these days, and in the nexus of those, particularly in Africa. So I look forward to talking a little bit about what we're doing in those areas, but I look forward even more to listening to all of you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fowler. I'd like to now invite the different panelists to join us up here. We have with us today, before I say that, I just want to mention that I have informed the panelists that we will have 3 minutes each to intervene. So, and I think the team has also told me that if we go over that time, then I will have to be fined for that. So, so please work with me. So first, Thank you. So first up, we have Jose Luis Chicoma, who is currently a senior advisor for food systems. He's also the former Minister of Production in Peru. And he's the past executive director of Ethos, a well-regarded think tank in Mexico, working with entrepreneurs to sustainably transform their food systems.
Thank you.
Welcome.
We move toward the middle, so folks online.
Thank you. And then I'd also like to invite an old friend, Zituni Udada, who is the Deputy Director of Climate Change at FAO, and has also served previously as the head of UNET Technology Unit, in addition to other roles in the past. Welcome, Zituni. We also have with us Jim Lee, who is a senior fellow at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and co-director at Center for Ocean Solutions. He served as the Director General of WWF International from 2005 to 2014, and is a lawyer for the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, in Kenya, and a litigator for the National Audubon Society and the US Department of Justice. Wow, you're a busy guy. Welcome. And then we have Rahel Bekele, who is a research scientist with the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University, and her work contributes to sustainable food systems by examining the economics of renewable energy, water management, irrigation systems in sub-Saharan Africa, with a particular focus on Ethiopia. Okay, welcome, Rahel. And then there is Ariel Ortiz Bobia. He's joined us. He's an associate professor of applied economics and policy at Cornell University, and his research evaluates the impacts of climate change on agriculture and the broader economy. Welcome, Ariel. And last but not least, we have James Garvin, who is a principal research scientist with the Institute of Environment at the University of Minnesota, whose work finds solutions for improving global food security while minimizing the environmental impact. As you can see, I have a panel here that will help us find the solutions that we're looking for today. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us all today. So I have been given a number of questions, and we've been having a long discussion about what we want from you today. So I'm going to start with you, Jose. In your experience as Peru's production minister and head of Ethos, what was the biggest challenge that you faced with regards to sustainable food systems and adaptation? And what does that mean for what you're doing today?
Thank you very much. Thank you, EDF, for the kind invitation to speak like in this very important conversation nowadays, especially with the global crisis. The biggest challenge was supporting small-scale food producers in a country that is mega diverse, where we face like a crisis of food insecurity. 50% of the population in Peru are facing food insecurity, and small-scale food producers have that key to protect and use our biodiversity, but usually they are not supported by the government. Peru is like that food paradox, mega diverse country, big food insecurity challenges, and that has been the case for decades, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit. But these small-scale farmers, for example, protect and use dozens of varieties of potatoes and hundreds of underutilized crops that are many of them are climate resilient. They are easier to grow. They are healthier than what we currently consume. But at the same time, we don't support them to protect our biodiversity. No? For decades, in the developing world, probably since the 80s or 90s, with the structural reforms promoted by many global organizations, actually, these reforms mandated in a way, like many countries, to support the big industrial sectors directed mostly for exports and with a mindset that was focused on economic growth. Those were the mandates that many developing countries had in the 80s and 90s. That's why we forgot completely about all the other positive aspects that small-scale food producers have. When I was Minister of Production, I wanted to make a change to support small-scale fishers. small-scale fishers in Peru catch up to like 300 different species, and these more than 300 are directed for direct human consumption. The industrial fisheries on the other side focus mostly on anchovy that is transformed into fish meal to feed other fishes and pigs in distant parts of the world. But the industrial fisheries, get most of the support from the government for decades. So it was a big challenge. I wanted to change this, but many different agencies and government officials were saying, no, it's the economy. It's the economy, it's the economy. That was the same argument in different parts of the government. And I said, no, it's about food also. It's also about nutrition. It's also about environment and inclusive growth. So the change wasn't easy. I faced many obstacles in a brief time, with political turmoil. But we secured many different reforms. We secured and designed a government food procurement program directly buying exclusively from small-scale fishers. We secured the approval of sustainability frameworks for fisheries that empowered small-scale fishers to protect the resources. And that's my conclusion for all of you, supporting small-scale food producers in many parts of the developing world is very hard. We face many obstacles if we want to do it. We have to go against an establishment that has focused mostly on the economy. And it's always about it's the economy. So if we include the environment, if we include nutrition, if we include addressing food insecurity and hunger, and also inclusive growth with a systemic perspective, we can change things. And we are going to use one of the few silver bullets that we have left to address the challenges of promoting the sustainable and healthy food systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And a very important point, given that at the end of the day, it is these small producers, the smallholders who are at the forefront of dealing with the impact of climate change. Zituni, so you were responsible for getting FAOs to develop its first climate strategy. And what's the significance of this? And what does it mean for FAO's action on climate change going forward?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Very pleased to be part of this discussion. Pick up on what you said, Jose. I think this is the problem, that the business model that was developed after the Second World War, in particular, just to produce food for the sake of producing food to meet demand at that time. We've been going with that model until now at the expense of depleting soil quality and biodiversity. Obviously, agriculture is also an important part of the emissions to climate change. So that's why that has to change. We're in new reality. Back to your point on the strategy. So we realized that even the strategy we had back in 2017, it has to adapt to the new reality. So our strategy is about looking at agriculture as an important part of the solution to the climate crisis and the biodiversity loss crisis. We want to look at the potential of innovation in helping smallholder farmers and farmers across the board. And in that strategy, we want to scale up what we do at the global level in terms of advocacy and connecting the conventions and the efforts between the work we do on biodiversity and climate change and other areas, because everything is interconnected. Even though we have a strategy on climate change, we also did at the same time a strategy on science and innovation, and a strategy for engaging private sector, and a strategy or framework for biodiversity. So the direction we see is that we need to transform the agri-food systems. We need to make them more inclusive, because not everyone has access, sadly, to the food available, and we have 828 million who go hungry every day. So we need to make it inclusive. We need to make it sustainable. Sustainability at the heart of businesses, of retailers, of everyone who's involved in the agri-food systems altogether. and more importantly, to make them resilient. Because all the recent shocks, including the pandemic and now the war in Ukraine, have shown that actually our agri-food systems are so fragile. That chain gets really interrupted and disrupted once you have this kind of shocks, and we have big lessons to learn from this. So the strategy has these three strands I mentioned: the global, also national and regional, because we need to work more with countries. Demands, the circumstances, the needs are different. We need to recognize that. And the third and last point is with regard to working with smallholder farmers and farmers at the farmers level. We need to engage more on that. And there is a lot there to do to work with governments and everyone involved in that. We have no choice. No choice, because the situation we're in, we really need to scale up those things. So for us at FAO is a great opportunity to work with everyone to accelerate this transition we're talking about.
Absolutely. And I think the point we are at this moment in history is one where no one can do this alone. So it is very encouraging to know that through this strategy, we'll see a lot more collaboration from global to local, and with, of course, a particular emphasis on those who have been left out the longest time. I'm going to turn to Jim, and I'm going to be very honest about something. When I came to EDF, I didn't know much about blue foods. And I found this to be one of the most fascinating parts of the conversation, because it always is when something is new, of course. So what I wanted to hear from you is, why are blue foods so important, and why have they been left out of the conversation so far? Maybe why is the focus coming now?
I was hoping you would ask. And this will tie a little bit into what the others have said. It's just true, right? That the resources that lie under the water are chronically ignored in everything we do, and presumably that's at least in part because they are out of sight and therefore easily out of mind. So that's part of what's happening here. But it's also just true that we have built a food system that is centered around agriculture. Probably because that's where the biggest players are, also because it's visible, also because it's important. And we have chronically neglected blue foods and the role that they play in a healthy, sustainable food system. And by blue foods, I mean plants and animals that are cultivated or captured in aquatic systems, so freshwater or oceans. They're already important, right? Blue foods are a principal source of protein for 3 billion people around the world. But in one country after another, they are managed as an economic resource, often for export revenue, but almost always for economics, maybe with some sustainability thrown in. And they are not thought of as part of the food system. And this goes to one of the points that Jose Luis was making a minute ago, that one has to look at the whole system, and we have many interests in this food system, right? And we need to build a system that provides the nutrition we need, the food security we need, that also can be sustained for the future, that can actually also begin to help us meet the climate challenge, and that can provide equitable livelihoods to people around the world. And blue foods have roles to play in all of those roles. And so I think for me, two things, because I realize 3 minutes is not very long. The first is that blue foods are incredibly diverse, right? I mean, there are more than 2,500 species of aquatic plants and animals that are produced for food. And they have each of them different profiles in terms of the nutrients they offer, in terms of the damage done by their production systems, in terms of the opportunities they offer for livelihoods and so forth. So 2,500 species. If you're talking about building a resilient food system, that diversity by itself is a big deal, right? Because diversity is key to resilience. But secondly, those 2,500 species are, most of them, more nutritious than any terrestrial produced animal source protein, right? And can often be with a much lower footprint, right? They clear a lot less land, generally speaking, but they also use less water, most of them. They also produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions, most of them. So it isn't to say that there's carte blanche for anything blue. It is to say that we can't afford to ignore the opportunities provided by this resource, and we can't afford not to take care of the ecosystems that support them and the communities that manage them. And there's a lot of potential there for us to meet the huge challenges that others have already described.
That's really, really fascinating. And I think there is a lot to do to get people to really understand the opportunity that exists there. Also the opportunity that exists in unlocking the potential of blue foods while at the same time addressing other challenges within our aquatic systems. So I'm now going to go on to Rahel. As I said, Rahel is from Ethiopia. I think Ethiopia tends to be called the food basket of Africa because of the high agricultural potential. And irrigation is often proposed as a key adaptation solution. Now, based on your research in Ethiopia and, of course, elsewhere, what are the main barriers to adopting irrigation systems within the region? And where do you think irrigation as an option holds the most promise for contributing to sustainable food system transformation?
Okay, thank you, Angela, for this great question, and thank you, EDF, for inviting me to talk in this platform. The great thing about irrigation is it's not only a robust climate smart agriculture technology, but it's very essential to deploy other types of climate smart agricultural technologies. However, despite the consistent policy and investment efforts, the progress in sub-Saharan Africa is very slow regarding adaptation to irrigation. The first one is regarding energy. If you look at the agri-food sector, currently consumes 30% of the total energy demand globally, which most of it based on fossil fuel, which contributes highly to greenhouse emission and the climate change. Africa consumes only 4% of aid, and it has high contribution to the adoption of irrigation. Irrigation is very limited. For example, in Ethiopia, it's less than 10% of the irrigable area is irrigated currently. The second one is high initial investment cost. Both groundwater and surface irrigation needs high initial investment while at the first stage. And the second one is while basically irrigation has two components, the technology components, which includes the water lifting technologies, the storage, and the technology, the mechanism that farmers convey the water to their farmland. The water lifting technology needs also high investment to adapt. The other related with the technology is there is lack of appropriate and accessible maintenance and repair services in those areas. Market also plays a major role to adapt irrigation, because without market access, irrigators cannot sell their product to the market. Studies show that when we come to irrigation and the sustainable food system, studies show that there are several potential pathways which irrigation can affect sustainable food system. The first one is through the production pathway. Irrigation enhances, supports the increasing crop productivity, yield. It intensifies crop diversity and enables households to produce throughout the year. The second one is through income intensification. Income increase. Income can be increased through the sale of irrigated crops and through irrigated-related employment. The third one is it provides other multiple purposes, such as hygiene, sanitation. And the fourth one is through it is one potential entry point for women empowerment. And instead of collecting water for the household. Women can be engaged in income-generating activities like irrigating plots and etc. And that.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up question for you. Against that background and the opportunity that irrigation can offer to African countries, are there any countries that have shown a willingness or that have actually started adopting some of these technologies?
What kind of technology?
The irrigation, that have started adopting irrigation practices within the agriculture sector on a larger scale?
Yeah, we can take Ethiopia. Adaptation, it's a kind of taking opportunity and also a necessity thing to adapt to climate change. For example, if you take Ethiopia, the Ethiopian economy mainly depends on agriculture. Agriculture contributes to 35% of GDP, 84% of export earnings, and 80% of the labor force. This leads us to this agriculture is characterized by rainfall, and rainfall in Ethiopia is especially and temporary variable, which highly affects the performance of the economy. Considering this problem, the Ethiopian government, starting from 2011, adopted a climate-resilient green economy that pushing the economy to the middle-income country, and with the resilient economy with no climate impact and no green gas emission compared to 2010. And this one of the appropriate irrigation, one of the appropriate adaptation methods is irrigation. And on top of that, the irrigation system is planned to be, the power is planned to be generated using renewable energy, solar, water, and wind.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'm going to turn to this side of the room, and I'll start off with Ariel, who, as I mentioned, is a professor at Cornell. So you've suggested in some of your work that regional specialization makes agricultural production more vulnerable to climate change, and yet many would argue that the regional specialization and efficiencies of scale have been critical to increasing food production at scale. Food production in the last decades. Now, if you could reimagine agriculture in the US or other developed countries, how would you make it more resilient to climate change without decreasing the overall food production?
Okay, so thanks for the invite and the question. And I hope that you can hear me. I forgot my proof of vaccination and they're serious outside. And I'll use my teaching voice to project to the back of the room so that you're kind of with me. So that finding, Rachel study published a couple, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago on US ag. And what we found is that despite growth in productivity in the US, in US agriculture, what we find is that growth has not translated into more resilient ag in the US. And we tried to kind of dig deeper and to see why that was happening. And one of the reasons was increased specialization, particularly in the Midwest. So like the share of the output that is in crops has grown over time in the Midwest, and now it's about like 60% of the value relative to kind of 40% in the 60s. So there's a change in the output. When you put in more of your eggs in the more sensitive basket, then you kind of, by construction, are becoming more sensitive, right? And what we wanted to highlight in the study is that sometimes when we talk about climate solutions and we think about, we tend to think about technology only, and I think we wanted to highlight that there are other policies, right? Like you think about like the renewable fuel standard, things that encourage farmers to do certain things, or very few things, a lot of it has unintended consequences. And this is one example, is that you're putting all your all your eggs in the same basket. So you're not surprised when, things go bad, they go bad for everyone at the same time. And some of you may say, well, farmers are insured, right? So no problem. Well, yes, they might be insured. There's a lot of subsidies going behind that, right? And to make sure that they actually get the insurance. But there are other players in the food supply chain that are not insured, right? So the prices do go up. And so what happens to the people who are not insured? So that risk is not really well taken care of down the value chain. Now, going to the question about reimagining and thinking about the future, if I can boil it down, and I'm allowed to simply oversimplify agricultural production because I'm an agronomist, so if you, I can do it. So many economists are also an agronomist. So if you think about a production, you bring in inputs, right? Some of them are chosen by the farmer, like fertilizer and things like that. Some are random, like the weather, and then you convert it to output. So how do you make more output? You can put more inputs. What does that mean? More land, more fertilizer, right? That's holding the technology fixed, right? We know what happens when you put more land. Where is the land going to come from? Right? You have to substitute some other land use. The low-hanging fruit is forest. There's biodiversity concerns regarding that. So that's very clear that that might not be the way of the future. We put more fertilizers. Well, there's also negative consequences of that. We can see the water quality issues stemming from that as well. Very, think about the U.S. and the Gulf of Mexico. It's again a prime example of what that can bring. So the way of the future is not necessarily just more inputs, right? We know how to do that. That's very simple. But the other way is to just make more with what we have, and that's basically increasing productivity. So for the same inputs, we produce more. That doesn't happen, like magic, right? There has to be research on how you actually transform these inputs into outputs. You need R&D, right? You need, farmers are not conducting R&D, right? They're adopting technologies that are out there. So you need people actually spending their time and careers working in this area, and investors, or governments, whoever, right? Coming up with the technologies that farmers are going to adopt down the road. So think about the future. I think we need R&D, R&D not only in certain places, but in many places, because one of the things about ag production is that it's not like a cell phone. You can have a cell phone, you design it in California, you make it in China, you use it in Africa. With ag technologies, you cannot do that, right? So there's this complementarities with the natural environment. So you really need to have R&D, happen in many places that are closer related to producers. So my view of the world, if we want to have a sustained ag production increases in the future, is to have a vibrant R&D all over the place. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I'm up over 3 minutes for sure.
Okay, I'm now going to move on to James Garvin. And you have been documenting how climate change is impacting food systems and predicting the impacts, how this will, what the future impacts would be. You also led IPCC's work on mitigation pathways. And you've argued for crop shifting as an adaptation pathway. Now, how do you put all of this together in that? How do we increase food security while at the same time reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing resilience of food production? So how, you're going to give us the answer to solve the whole problem.
In 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Let me get my timer on, so I'm actually just 3 minutes. That's okay. That is, there's a lot to unpack there, but thank you for the question, and thank you, EDF, for having me. Thank you all for your attention. I was one of the authors on the IPCC mitigation chapter. But my job there was to show how mitigation in the agricultural sector was also almost always adaptive. So it wasn't the hardest job, because it often is. And I'd like to get to that. But first, I'd like to sort of just reframe this question of what a more resilient ag system could look like in the context of something Dr. Fowler said, which was talking about really the demands we have on the land system going forward, right? When we think about land, it's super overburdened, right? What are we expecting our global agricultural land system to do? It's feed the 2 billion more people who are coming to dinner, feed them the steak that 4 billion more are going to be ordering. Biofuels, we expect biofuels to be part of it, right? It's currently 9% of all kilocalories. 9% of all kilocalories go to biofuels, and then all this. Oh, and also, people talk about land as we're just going to transform farming systems into things that are locally more sustainable and sequester more carbon without thinking of that in the big picture. So it's supposed to do all this in the context of a changing climate. So it's really overburdened as it is. And so I think when we think about adaptation on the land, we really do need to think about this larger problem. So there are a few adaptation things that can be done, which fortunately also help to mitigate the emissions problem. And I'd like to talk about some of those because they are, I think, really promising. One is farming in a way that improves soil, the soil quality, and that is the adaptation in that improved soil quality can better withstand drought, changes in their precipitation cycle, which certainly are happening. Another thing is conservation agriculture, and that's very similar to farming practices that increase soil carbon and soil health, but keeping the farms with cover crops or limited till or no-till policies can also help reduce soil erosion, which is a big problem. Crop switching is something that our research has shown is taking place in response to climate change. But and finally, a key one that echoes what others have said is more investment into crops. Research has shown that I'm at 3 minutes, so I'll just stop there. No, okay. I showed that. For example, that there has been adaptation has taken place just organically and has had some reduction on the negative impacts of climate change. But more investment can help that along.
So thank you very much. I think the sense I get now is that, I think we're all in agreement we need to be working towards this resilient sustainable food systems, and we need to do this sooner rather than later. So a question to all of you, and I think I will start with you, Carrie, is why is it that some countries or regions have actually started that process of addressing sustainable food systems earlier than others? And maybe you could give us, you could illustrate with a story of, illustrate this with a case where there is some success or where even some of the solutions that are being put may not be as successful in ensuring long-term resilience.
Well, the first question, why have some countries started earlier than others and done more than others? I don't know. I think if every country started at the same time and in the same way, we would want some social scientists to study how that happened, because that would be really unusual. Obviously, it's a question of opportunity and resources and such. There are many, many examples, and it's easy to point to examples of where countries have done fairly short-sighted things that have exacerbated the problem. Sometimes they've done that for political reasons, for short-term gains, but they've exacerbated the problem. We're seeing that, frankly, right now with some of the export bans for political purposes, which don't really work internally and exacerbate the food price volatility externally. It's easy to point to individual adaptive measures that look good, and if you don't go very much farther than that, I'll give you a personal example. My wife and I have a farm in upstate New York in the Hudson Valley, and on the side of a hill where you can't do any real farming, we have a few head of a rare and threatened breed of cow called the red pole. It's extremely good at converting grass into meat, and it gives birth without a veterinarian and is very healthy. It's very adaptive. Is that a solution for a lot of our problems? And if you look at Peru, I was talking with one of your fellow citizens recently, talking about growing potatoes there. Potatoes are indigenous to the Andes in Peru, and talking about climate change and the varieties that are that have been growing at the lower elevations have been sort of steadily moving up the mountains because of the temperature change. This is fine, but at a certain point you run out of mountain. So you can only go so much farther. So I'll only say in closing that from my standpoint, I've always been looking for and yearning, frankly, to find just one or two countries that are in a sense all in with the challenge of adaptation with sustainability and are willing to do what it takes to, in a very sensitive way, to try to help them transform their agricultural systems. You don't find it every day.
Any other views from this side? Or maybe I start with you. What is your view in terms of how then we can get these countries to adopt these as soon as possible? Because as Carrie has said, there isn't really a country we can say that is already doing it, but they're all trying. So what should be our starting point? And especially you who has sat in government, who has seen the challenges.
Yep. I think there's an amazing opportunity. Like, we're looking for examples, but there's an amazing opportunity for many countries that is related with the Food System Summit and the food systems pathways. Before the Food System Summit, in Spanish, the word sistemas alimentarios, food systems, sounded a little bit weird. No, it wasn't widely used or known by many people. It's like, sounds very weird. It's like cacophony. But after the Food System Summit, there's this opportunity, finally, of addressing systemically the food challenges, no? And this has to be done at different levels. From my experience in government, we really didn't talk systemically about food. Like, and there is a problem, and I've seen that in many Latin American countries and all over the world. But it's not just government. When I was very active in civil society in Mexico, for example, and all over Latin America, the nutritionists were with their battles, the environmentalists with other types of battles. The ones that talked about blue food also, they didn't talk with the people that were promoting a more sustainable and inclusive small-scale agriculture. So it's also in civil society and also in academia. Have we designed the structures for academia so people and experts from different disciplines talk together systemically about food challenges? No. So at least in those three levels, after the Food System Summit, I see more interest. If we don't get that interest and transform it into actions, we're going to waste an amazing opportunity.
Yeah. First of all, I want to respond to this question. But first, I should note that if you want to know more about blue foods, you should read the Blue Food Assessment. I can't believe I didn't mention that at the beginning. Bluefood.earth, led by Stanford with Stockholm Resilience Center, EAT, and 100 scientists around the world. EDF, a very close partner, and then taking that into the summit process. But I wanted to touch on this because, I mean, I would say just there are many things to say, but two from a blue food perspective. One is, I think one of the things that came out of the Food System Summit process was a recognition that we need to help decision makers understand the relevance of these different resources to the things they most care about. Right? And so blue foods, let's just call it seafood, has been the province of fisheries ministries, right? Who are at best in most countries, not Peru, are second-tier ministry, right? And part of the mission of the blue food discussion is to help health ministers and development ministers and finance ministers understand that actually these are resources that are important to things they're trying to achieve, right? To reducing non-communicable disease, to addressing stunting, to supporting developments. So that's part of it, right? Is just helping to translate the things we know about food systems into terms that are relevant to decision makers as part of helping them to achieve their priorities. And so that's one thing. But I think a second thing is that we need to also be pushing on how the private sector can move ahead on some of these challenges and can also help create the political space for governments to do what they need to do. And we've seen lots of efforts on that in the last 20 years on deforestation, on sustainable seafood, on other domains. But one of the things that comes out of, I think, of the food system summit kinds of discussions is that our conception of sustainability has been focused on production, reducing deforestation, reducing overfishing. It needs actually to be a much broader conception of what does it take to build the food system we need. And that we ought to be looking to companies to step up to that challenge, right? Helping to develop and to encourage all of us to shift to the options which are better for the planet and actually also better for us. And so I think one needs to push on both of those avenues, among others.
Let me just add to that and answer your question. We've seen that recently when COVID started and how some countries were ahead of others and then others started to catch up. And this is our human reaction to crises and to emergencies. But there is a lot to learn from that. Now, what do you put in place in terms of policies and measures that can help you to get out of this crisis? And more importantly, how do you prepare for the next one? Because there will be a next one. So we've seen the two things, the political will in doing something about the crisis, combined with the scientists coming in and saying, you need to wear a mask because of X, Y, and Z, you need to keep a distance because transmission, etc. So you need that combination so that people can trust that advice and do something about it. It's really a combination of political will that can make things happen and people endorsing the scientific evidence and respecting that. And I think for the transformation of agri-food system and dealing with hunger is the same in a sense. And another example, what we talk about, it's hard, it's diverse. Yes, it is. But 15 years ago or so, we had the same thing with the energy transition. When initially everyone was saying it's very expensive, solar panels are not affordable, etc. But as soon as there was policies that every country around the world put policies for renewable energy. I don't think there is any country in the world that doesn't have that. Strategies for renewable energy, attracting investment, and combined with energy efficiency. So my point is, it's a matter of time, and we need to learn from those experiences so we don't lose time like we did with the COVID and the energy transition. So that now we think about those and say, actually, my last point, what makes a really big difference is to think ahead, to think long term. And there are things we need to do now, but what agriculture would look like in the next 5 and 10 years? That's a big question, but unless we have that in our mind, we're only going to keep going into sort of monthly and yearly basis. Yeah? So the strategy in FAO we have for climate change is for the next 10 years. Give you an example. I think we have to look into that time frame and start putting policies from now, because whatever we do now is going to influence the journey and the trajectory. So it's really my point is we have so much to learn from, and this is a test for all of us. The pandemic for some countries is gone. We don't wear masks anymore. And really, I think what did we pick up from it? Because the next pandemic happened, we're going to do the same thing. Lockdown and masks and hand sanitizers, that's it. They were not resilient at all. But that's my point.
I really appreciate that point, especially about planning for the short term to be able to catalyze that action for the long term. Because I think generally, when it comes to climate action, we've set our sights very far into the future without thinking about some of those short-term things that we need to start doing now to get the ball rolling. So we have visions of what we'll do in 2050. We have plans of what will be happening in 2050. But what we're going to do tomorrow is still not as clear. And I think that's why quite often we end up talking about the long term without really thinking about the crisis at hand. And I do agree with you, we really need to learn also from other crises. You talked about political will, and I'm really interested in knowing also about what is the role of gender, culture, and the legal structures in all of this. I know you did speak about the benefits of moving to irrigation practices also for freeing up women to have more opportunity to to engage in other activities, as part of their livelihoods. But what is that role? Is that something that features in these conversations? And how then do we also capitalize on the potential that's there? So I can start with you, Rahel, or anyone else on this side. I know I should actually be sitting where I can see everyone. So
Please start with them. No problem.
Anyone, any takers?
I was going to talk about the previous question, but
You can go ahead,
okay.
and we'll come back to this one later.
Yeah, sounds good. So the way, so I'll try to rephrase it in the way that I understand it. So essentially, it's like what some countries might be ahead of the curve in terms of trying to incorporate environmental aspects into agricultural production. And so when I think about, and I'm trying to give a kind of an economist, again, I'm the token economist, I guess. Here. So I'll give you kind of that perspective. And the way I think agriculture is a very different type of productive activity than many other activities, in the sense that you can think about resources, right, as an input to production. Farmers think about their soil, right? That's an important factor into how they produce. At the same time, it's water quality depends from agricultural production as well. So there's that connection between things that, it's both an input and part, you can think also as an output. And there are things that farmers do care about themselves for their own bottom line. You think about soils, right? Or the practices that we might think as, they're environmentally friendly and it's actually going to their advantage, like rotation, right? There's a reason why they have like corn and soybeans. Well, otherwise they have weeds showing up and then they don't want that. So they have that. They will do that, irrespective of, whether you try to convince them to do it or not. But there are other things that are good for other people, right? That might not necessarily be in their own personal advantage, right? So this is what economists call a public good. And we, as an economist, what we like to try to inculcate in students is that don't expect people to be supplying public goods just because they're altruists. Like, you wouldn't set the rules like that, just expecting people to do that, right? And I think to get to a system where the agricultural sector is incorporating those aspects, you have to recognize first that there's public goods that are coming from the agricultural sector for improving biodiversity. And farmers are not necessarily going to do that out of their goodwill. And there have to be policies in place to compensate and to help farmers actually supply those public goods, and change the idea that agricultural production is just to maintain rural jobs or just provide calories, but also to protect the environment. So I think that's another aspect, that it's a service, it's a production that they're putting out, and they have to be paid for that, right? And I think if we don't see it as a output, we're not going to pay for it. And society, if you don't pay for it, they're not going to deliver it. So that's kind of my econ view.
Absolutely. Any more views before I now turn to the audience to see if we have additional questions? First, Rahel.
To answer the previous question, in my opinion, the starting point should be from the necessity as well as from the opportunity side view. Because my the example would be, again, Ethiopia. For example, if the Ethiopian economy depends on agriculture, we need to have to be more climate change adaptive. We have to be more conscious about climate change adaptation methods. On the other, from the opportunity to take the benefit of the opportunity, Ethiopia is endowed with vast renewable energy resources, for example, water, wind, solar. We have to take those opportunities and coming to combine the necessity point of view together. And for the fulfillment of this purpose, all the government, the rural farm households, the private sector, and the development partners should work together. And coming to the second question regarding women empowerment, as studies show that using irrigation empower women more than the other members of the household members, and especially using standalone pumps which are operating using diesel or solar, enable them to use in whatever situation they are in, because it's very easy to move, to use, as long as you have the water source. And yeah,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I know part of your question was how are blue foods important to gender, so I wanted to speak to that. Okay, I guess a couple of things. I mean, about half the workforce in the blue food sector is women. A lot of those jobs are in processing. I mean, they're more prominent in processing, but there are very important roles for women in harvesting, and those are, number one, often invisible, unrecognized in governance and management, and voiceless, and at the same time often centrally important for food security, for their households and their communities, because more of the food they harvest goes to direct consumption in their households and communities. So part of support to small-scale fisheries and finding ways to build more vibrant small-scale fishing communities is actually paying attention to gender and making sure that women have a voice in the management of those fisheries, and that the role they're playing in those fisheries is recognized.
Okay, so I'm going to now open the floor for questions from the audience. I like that. So please introduce yourself.
Eileen McClellan, EDF. So my question is about maladaptation. So you've all articulated nicely that we face a challenge both in the short term and the long term in terms of food security. Politicians, by and large, focus on the short term. So how do we ensure that the short-term changes that are made to address the current crisis don't actually lead to us adopting practices which make things worse in the long term? What are your suggestions on how to do that?
Okay, I think what I'll do is I'll take a couple more questions and then turn to the panel. So.
You don't have to hold it close to your mouth. Okay. Yeah, you just hold it back. Okay, sorry. Nathan Truitt, the American Forest Foundation. Is really interested in that notion of trade-offs. We're asking a lot of land, and one of the things we're asking is sequester and store more carbon, and it's hard to imagine a scenario where we avoid the worst impacts of climate change without some kind of reforestation at scale. Because I'm listening to these pretty dire predictions around food security. I'm thinking, well, what does that mean to take land out of production? So I would just be really interested in your advice on how do we think about, we need to do reforestation, but we're facing these food security challenges. And how do we not be siloed as a forest community and the agricultural community, but how instead we do that in an integrated way?
Okay, so while you're thinking about more questions, I'm going to turn back to the panel with these two. So how do you think about the trade-offs between food and forests? And how do we address the short versus the long term? How do we ensure that the solutions we do now will not lock us into maladaptation for the long term? So who wants to go first?
I guess. Well, for the first one, for maladaptation, I would say have great places like EDF, right? Having a big voice and making sure that those good ideas about good policy are heard and and are well understood, right? Like that's just like it has to be, the ideas have to be in the marketplace of ideas for them to be kind of acknowledged. So that's I guess that's the easy answer. Regarding the other one in terms of forest, and I'm gonna. I hope I'm not shortcutting any answers. Here, my view is there's a technology. I feel like the trend of avoiding deforestation is more productive ag, and I think that's where it starts. The lags are long for R&D, and you have to start early, right? when you get to the point where you haven't been investing in R&D for decades, and then you put, conservation, in a frontal collision with food production, I know who votes and I know who puts pressure on politicians, and I know who's going to win that fight. So I say go earlier and then think about making agriculture more productive so that the pressures are off on the forest. So that's one view. I'm not saying it's the only one, but it's one.
Yeah, if I might answer the question on food production and deforestation. We definitely need to produce more with less, not with what we have, with much less, because there is so much potential for efficiency. Efficiency in the use of water, in the use of electricity on farms for food production. It's a hungry sector for energy and water and soil, obviously. So there is a big potential for efficiency, and that's what we need to convey in terms of avoiding these trade-offs. I don't think we need to cut any more trees to grow food. We've got 828 million people who go hungry every day, and we throw a third of the food that is produced for human consumption. So we throw a lot of food away. So why do we need more land to produce food for what? Let's first stop throwing food away and help those, particularly in developing countries, who need to address the food loss because they don't have infrastructures, refrigeration, just to have food stored for a couple of days, which will make a difference. And if you have refrigeration, you can store other things, of course. And here, you point on irrigation, exactly as you said. What we want is really to help farmers to have access to renewable energy. Yeah, renewable energy combined with drip irrigation. Again, my point is on efficiency, okay? Because we use 70% of water just for agriculture. So there is a big scope for that. We have to pay attention to trade-offs. Now, we're expecting about 10 billion people by 2050. If we say, we need to increase production, and we need to increase it by around 60% by 2050. We cannot only focus on that linear objective and say, produce to feed 10 billion by 2050. No, we have to do it in a way that can be kind to the environment and biodiversity. We don't want to repeat the same mistake the model you were saying, just continue to produce, feed 10 billion people, and then keep releasing greenhouse gas emission, depleting biodiversity. No, this is the big lesson we need to learn now, so we can give more attention to ecosystem restoration and investment in nature. This is the reality we live in. We can only defeat hunger really if we look at all these interlinked parameters and look at them together. So my point is on trade-offs. Pay very big attention to that. Not sure you agree or disagree. You're looking at me. Just wondering.
We'll talk later. I was just thinking about.
I bet it disappeared.
I completely. So I just want to add a couple of things. First of all, I think. Well, I don't know. I don't have a very satisfactory answer to your question about how you prevent the short term from undermining the long term. But your challenge is actually a central one for all of us, right? I mean, how do we map out a vision and a strategy for the long term that recognizes the realities of navigating the short term and doesn't count on having ministers like Jose Luis who are willing to do bold things in every position that we need them in, right? So I think that's that's politics. But on forests, I spent a lot of my time in forests before I discovered the water. And I just want to add a couple of things. So what Sunny said, protection, right? It is just true, right? That deciding that some parts of the landscape are going to be protected is an important part of containing the pressure. I think a second is recognizing the multiple values that come out of those lands so that those are better reflected. So natural capital and all that's come from that is part of actually helping us make a different set of trade-offs, making trade-offs in a more intelligent way. And the third thing we haven't talked about, I don't think very much here, is diet. 80% of the land in agriculture is for livestock, right? So eating less beef is actually an important part of this equation, and helping people shift to healthier diets and to diets that are both healthier and produce less pressure on the landscape is inevitably, I think, part of getting to the balance you're talking about.
Can I?
I believe you can go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was reflecting on your question, and it's very difficult. No, right now, we probably haven't learned from the last 4 or 5 global food crises to address the structural issues during the crisis and after the crisis. And probably it's not going to happen right now. I don't think that we have the structures in government that I mentioned briefly in the last question to address and link those short-term responses with the longer term. But if we don't start building those structures right now, we're going to be vulnerable for the next crisis also, and not addressing these long-term failures or flaws in global food systems. And that is related with food production and forests, and there are many calculations on this, but estimates on how we already produce more than food for more than 10 billion people. So it's addressing like the structural problems that go against many of the most powerful interests globally related with biofuels, concentration in global food supply chains, and also beef. So if we don't make and take a bold decision of addressing at least those 3 structural problems, things are not necessarily going to change, and we're going to try at the national level to change many of those global trends and patterns, and we are not going to be able to fix it. So I thought briefly, and I was probably super naive at the start of this crisis, that this was finally the call for action and for decisive and bold action from the most powerful nations in the planet, but it wasn't. So that's something that probably in the next few years, I might be still naive and think that it's going to change, but right now it's not changing.
But we're going to be optimistic. Okay, so.
Sure. I mean, I'd like to address both questions a little bit. In terms of helping ministers to not make short-sighted decisions, there is an effort going to natural capital, actually led at Stanford, the Natural Capital Project, and other things like the Changing Wealth of Nations project at the World Bank, that attempts to put market values on preserving natural capital so there aren't these short-sighted decisions. There's still room for many other actors in the space. Of course, that's hard to be comprehensive, but it's a real thing that I'm really glad to see. In terms of the reforestation, my little rant maybe about sort of overburdened land was a little pessimistic perhaps, but that's because maybe I didn't get to the optimistic side of the coin, which is there is a lot of inefficiencies in the system that really can be addressed. And I think they've been mentioned here, but maybe one that we didn't call out quite so explicitly, at least not in these terms, is the fact that there are really large yield gaps around the world, and these can be closed. It's a lot of work to close them, much easier to identify them than to close them, but I'm just bringing up the lowest performing farmers up to just the 50th percentile farmer. It feeds is enough calories for 850 million people. So there is a room for optimism there. I don't think that, by the way, I'm glad you said reforestation, not afforestation, because these schemes to plant 1 trillion trees, or even some things that happen often end very badly, but where there has been forest, putting it back is good. But some people, I think, I'm not saying you did, but I think people often aren't aware that a very helpful solution can be just restoring degraded forest, right? So it's not like taking land out of production, just like helping it get back to the state it was in earlier.
I'll make a couple of comments. One is that, obviously, if we want to protect forests, I think we have to be mindful of increasing agricultural production, because historically, the most successful way of increasing agricultural production has been to cut down forests. That's what's happened historically. And let's be honest, the environmental community hasn't had an easy time with this issue of how do you sustainably in an environmentally good way increase production so as not to cut down the forest. But we can't have our cake and eat it both at the same time on this issue. We have to be more, we're going to have to be a lot more sensitive about the complexities of this issue. I'll come back to your question about maladaptation, and I'll use it from my own field. And I'll tell you something that worries me right now. And that is that we're experiencing, obviously, a terrible historic proportion drought in the Horn of Africa. 30% of Pakistan is underwater. If it doesn't recede soon, it's going to have a serious impact on wheat production there. And we can go all around the world and tell these kinds of stories. One thing that happens sometimes in these kinds of crises is that we think, well, this is an opportunity. And well-meaning humanitarian organizations will ship in high-yielding varieties of seeds, wheat, to the farmers in Pakistan that have lost their seed supplies. And time and again, what I've found is that very often, if that's not done properly, people who really know what they're doing and with seeds that are truly adapted to the local area, that what you end up doing is taking high-yielding wheat varieties that are high-yielding in the western part of the United States and are zero yielding in much of the developing world. Absolute disaster. So these are the kind of simplistic solutions that we need to avoid. And yet I've spent my whole life in the seed bank and crop improvement world, so I know it can be done properly. But that's there are two sides to that coin. We have to be careful which one we're playing with.
Okay.
Thank you. Regarding the maladaptation problem, yeah, it's very concerning to not able to harmonize the short-term and long-term solution. For instance, it's common to use fertilizer to increase yield, but on the other hand, studies show that it's not good to use organic fertilizer for health and environmental pollution. But in my opinion, everything is context specific, and farmers for a long time, they used to use, for example, manual organic fertilizer. And the main thing is to use the resource we have efficiently and to consider the local knowledge into the modern knowledge together and come up with a better idea, I think.
Thank you. We have about 3 minutes, so I'm going to allow one more question from the audience. Okay.
What if you could talk about the challenges and opportunities of aquaculture?
Yes. So aquaculture is one of the fastest growing food sectors in the world, right? And it is by far the fastest growing part of the blue food sector. I mean, it is the growing part of the blue food sector. There have been lots of problems in aquaculture. There has been a lot of progress in the last 20 years in addressing some of those problems, right? In reducing the intensity of reliance on feed and reducing the intensity of reliance on fish in feed. So I mean, there have been real steps forward in various ways. But there's no question that fostering sustainable, well-managed aquaculture, especially small-scale aquaculture, is going to be very important in some parts of the world. We have a ton of aquaculture already in Asia, right? But Africa has relatively little. And I think there are a lot of people who see sustainable, well-managed, small-scale, largely small-scale, not exclusively small-scale, freshwater aquaculture in Africa as a significant part of meeting the challenge of food security and nutrition on that continent. And that's not the only place, but I mean, that really stands out. But no question, aquaculture is going to be a significant part of growing a sustainable food system.
Thank you. So I just want to end by asking each of the panelists in 3 words or in 30 seconds, so you can choose between the two. What's the most important thing we should be focusing on as we head to Sharm el-Sheikh to COP27? We're in the middle of a food crisis. We're going to have a global community talking about climate there. What is the most important thing or message we should be taking with us? You have 3 words or 30 seconds, your choice. So I'll start with you because you did well enough the last time. So you get 4 words.
Okay. These are systems problems. Okay. I'll leave it at that. I got an extra word.
Exactly. I get a 3rd.
Okay, and then
So more than 3 words, so 30 seconds. I think, so going back to the idea of shipping seeds that are completely unadapted to one place of the world that is not really, where it doesn't fit, I think that the future comes through a lot of research and development, and that agricultural technologies are very different than other technologies, and we have to recognize that there has to be a lot of regional R&D happening in close connection with local producers, and I think that without that we're going to be committing the same mistake over and over and over again.
thank you. Harry?
I think that we have to learn to get our goals and incentives aligned.
I think linking short and long-term responses in a systemic way is like the biggest challenge and the most probably like difficult thing to do. Government, society, academia, but we have to work towards that.
I think what the world expecting at COP27 and beyond is that we start talking about the solutions we need to scale up. We've been talking about problems for so long. We know it needs to be done, just not doing them fast enough and at large scale.
Don't forget the blue. V doesn't count, does it?
Okay.
Investing more on different kinds of irrigation systems.
And of course, I will end by saying what I also took from here was, let's not forget the small scale shareholders. That was my way of getting them to summarize the meeting for me. So thank you very much. This was very interesting. I think I've really enjoyed and learned a lot. And at this point, I want to hand over to Eric Schwab, who leads our People and Nature program.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. And my job is very simple. First, to thank this panel and all the panels throughout the day. It has been